We begin, as we always must, with the truth of it, plain and unadorned. Clara Bishop was 44 years old, penniless, and standing in the rain outside a house that no longer belonged to her. She had lost her husband and her only son to the sea 2 winters before, and now her husband's own brother, Amos Bishop, had cast her from the family home, claiming she owed him for debts her husband had supposedly left behind. All she carried into the world that morning was a carpet bag, a shawl gone thin at the elbows, and $11.40 wrapped in a handkerchief. With that small, trembling sum, she did something the whole town of Gull Hollow, Maine, would call foolish for months to come. She bought the crumbling, abandoned widow's point light at auction for $11, a tower the town had left to rot the moment a new automated beacon rose on Cutter's Ledge. They laughed as she signed the paper. They shook their heads as she carried her bag up that lonely spit of rock. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that sealed away above the broken lantern room of that forgotten lighthouse lay a secret that would not only rewrite her own fortune, but would restore an entire harbor, clear the name of a man 3 decades dead, and bring a reckoning to the very people who had turned her away. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Bishop. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, a home others have written off, or a life you are quietly rebuilding from almost nothing, tell us in the comments. We would love to know where you are joining us from tonight. Clara had not always been a woman with nothing. She had been raised in the small inland village of Fenwick Cross, the daughter of a cooper named Nathaniel Hale, a patient, broad, shouldered man who built barrels for the fishing fleets along the coast, and who believed, with the quiet stubbornness of self-taught men, that everything discarded still had a use in it, if you were willing to look closely enough. It was from her father that Clara learned to read wood the way other people read faces, to run her palm along a plank, and know whether it was sound or rotten at the heart, to see in a pile of what other men called scrap, the bones of something whole. She learned patience at his workbench, learned that a broken thing was not the same as a worthless thing, and learned above all to finish what she began, however long it took. Her mother, Ruth, had died when Clara was 12, and it had fallen to Clara to keep the small household running, to cook and mend and tend her father's accounts, a duty she carried without complaint, for she had inherited also her mother's steadiness, a calm that did not shatter easily under strain. When she was 22, she married Thomas Bishop, a young fisherman from Gull Hollow with a laughing voice, and a boat called the Providence, inherited from his own father, and she left Fenwick Cross for the coast, trading the smell of sawdust for the smell of salt and tar. Thomas was a good man, if not always a careful one, generous to a fault, quick to lend money to any neighbor in trouble, slow to ask for its return. Clara loved him for it, even as she quietly kept the family's true accounts hidden in a tin box, for she understood, the way her father had taught her, that kindness and prudence were not enemies but partners, and that a household needed both to survive a hard coast. They had one son, Daniel, born with his father's easy laugh and his mother's watchful eyes, a boy who grew up scrambling over the rocks at Widow's Point, and who once told his mother, pointing up at the old lighthouse before it was decommissioned, that he meant to be its keeper himself one day, so that no ship would ever again be lost on those ledges. Clara had laughed and told him that was a fine and honest ambition, and had thought, foolishly perhaps, that they had years ahead of them to see whether he meant it. She spent those years doing what women along that coast had always done, mending nets, salting fish, keeping the books not only for her own household but quietly for 2 or 3 of the poorer fishing families who could not read numbers as easily as she could, doing it without pay, without complaint, simply because it seemed to her the decent thing to do for neighbors who had little enough as it was. She was known in Gull Hollow as a careful, sturdy woman, not given to gossip, not given to despair, the sort of person others brought their worries to rather than their pity. It was a good life, a plain life, built stone by stone the way her father had built his barrels, meant to hold steady against whatever weather came. None of them could have known how much weather was still to come. The weather came in the autumn of 1887, in the shape of a storm the old fisherman would speak of afterward simply as the Grey Gale, for the sky that day had turned the color of wet slate an hour before the wind rose, and had stayed that color for 3 days after. Thomas had taken the Providence out with Daniel, then 17, against Clara's quiet unease, for the herring were running late that year and the family's debts, small as they were, had been pressing. She stood on the widow's walk of their own house that evening, and watched the horizon for lanterns that never came, and she would tell no one, not even herself in later years, how long she stood there before she finally understood that she was, in fact, a widow twice over in a single night, a wife without a husband, and a mother without her son. The town grieved with her as coastal towns do, with casseroles left on doorsteps and quiet nods at the market, and for a while that grief was almost enough to carry her through. But grief, she soon learned, does not pay debts, and it was in the settling of Thomas's affairs that Amos Bishop, Thomas's older brother, a hard, calculating man who had never much cared for Clara and had resented, in his silent way, how easily his brother had loved her, came forward with a ledger of his own, claiming that Thomas had borrowed heavily against the Providence and against the house itself to cover debts of Amos's failing store, debts Thomas had apparently guaranteed as a brother's favor years before. Clara, who had kept every honest account of her own household in her tin box, found nothing there to contradict him, for the paper Amos produced bore what appeared to be Thomas's own signature, shaky and hurried, the kind a generous man might sign without reading closely, trusting family. She had no lawyer, no coin to hire one, and no strength left, in that first raw winter of her grief, to fight a battle she was not certain she could win. Amos took the boat. Amos took the house, and on a cold morning in March, with a gentleness that made his cruelty somehow worse, he told her she was welcome to stay through the week if she needed it, and then handed her $11.40, calling it a kindness, calling it more than the law required of him, and watched from the doorway as she walked away down the frozen road with her carpet-bag, a woman with a lifetime of careful work behind her, and it seemed nothing at all ahead. She might have gone back to Fenwick Cross, back to her father's old workshop, now run by a cousin, and asked for shelter, and perhaps no one in Gull Hollow would have blamed her for it. But something in Clara Bishop, some stubborn thread of her father's patience, refused to leave the coast that had taken her husband and her son, as though leaving would mean surrendering them entirely to the sea. She was walking along the shore road 2 days later, turning over in her mind the thin question of where a woman with almost nothing might sleep that night, when she came upon a small crowd gathered at the base of Widow's Point, watching a county auctioneer stand upon a crate and call out, with visible boredom, the sale of the old lighthouse and its half-acre of rock, decommissioned the previous spring when the new steel tower at Cutter's Ledge had rendered it obsolete. The lighthouse had stood empty for a year by then, its lantern room dark, its lower rooms stripped of anything the county considered worth taking, its keeper's cottage beside it missing half its roof. No one wanted it. The fishermen considered it bad luck, cursed even, for its last keeper, a man named Ezra Thorne, had died in disgrace there some 30 years before, accused of stealing a great sum of money entrusted to him by the town, and no family since had wished to live in a house so shadowed by scandal, even one now crumbling into the rocks. The bidding, such as it was, opened at $10 and closed almost as quickly. For the only other interested party, a merchant's agent looking to build a private dock, dropped out when he learned the county would not clear the title dispute over the Rocky Point for another year. Clara, standing at the edge of the crowd with her carpet-bag still in her hand, heard herself bid $11 before she had fully decided to speak, and heard the auctioneer's gavel fall a moment later with a kind of stunned amusement, and heard, too, the laughter that rippled through the small crowd. Not unkind exactly, but the laughter of people who believed they were watching a desperate woman throw away her last coin on a cursed ruin. Perhaps she was. She walked up the rocky path to her new home with 80 cents to her name, and no clear plan beyond a roof, however broken, over her head. And she told herself, climbing those worn stone steps, that whatever else was true, at least the lighthouse could not be taken from her by any brother, in law's forged signature, for no one else on earth had wanted it. The first days at Widow's Point were spent simply making the tower livable. A labor Clara approached the way her father had approached a barrel with a cracked stave, assessing rather than despairing, finding what could be saved before mourning what could not. She swept years of gull droppings and broken glass from the lower rooms, patched what she could of the keeper's cottage roof with driftwood, and tar she begged from a sympathetic net, mender named Josephine Calloway, and spent her evenings by a small fire built from scavenged wood, mending her own clothes by the last grey light through a cracked window. It was on the fourth evening, while searching the tower for anything dry enough to burn, that she climbed the spiral stair to the lantern room itself, empty now of its great lens, which the county had removed and sold, leaving only the iron framework and the small windowless watchroom just below it, where old Ezra Thorne would once have slept between his rounds tending the light. She noticed, running her hand along the watchroom's back wall out of the same old habit her father had given her, that one section of the wooden paneling sounded different beneath her knuckles than the rest. Not the dull, solid knock of wood against stone, but a faint, hollow answer, the sound her father had taught her to listen for in a barrel with something hidden inside its false bottom. She might, on another night, in another life, have dismissed it as nothing. But Clara Bishop did not dismiss hollow sounds, not since childhood, and so she worked at the seam with the edge of a rusted fire poker until a narrow panel, no wider than a cellar door, swung inward with a groan of old hinges, revealing a shallow space built into the tower's thick wall, and within it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow with age, a small strong box and a leather, bound ledger, both untouched, it seemed, for 30 years. Her hands trembled as she carried them down to the fire, less from cold now than from something closer to dread, for she remembered well enough the old story the fisherman told of Ezra Thorne, and she understood even before opening the ledger's cover that she might be holding the very thing he had supposedly stolen, the strong-box. When she forced its rusted lock with the same poker, held not the fortune in gold coin the old rumors had always claimed, but something smaller and stranger, a modest number of coins, perhaps $300 in old currency, along with several folded papers bound with ribbon, and a miniature portrait of a star. None. Kind-faced man she did not recognize. The ledger itself, written in a careful, aging hand, told a story altogether different from the one Gull Hollow had told itself for 3 decades. It began, as such records often do, with dry columns of figures, contributions collected from every fishing family in the town, in the terrible year of 1858, after a winter storm had destroyed the original harbor breakwater and left half the fleet unable to safely dock, a common fund raised by the townspeople themselves, entrusted to the harbor master of that era, a man named Cornelius Grayle, to be used for rebuilding. But as Clara read further by firelight, the entries shifted from figures to a kind of confession, Ezra Thorne's own hand growing smaller and more urgent as he described, discovering that Cornelius Grayle intended not to rebuild the breakwater at all, but to quietly pocket the fund and instead charge the fishermen a permanent toll to use a private dock he meant to build with a portion of their own stolen money, a scheme he had already begun setting in motion through false accounting of his own. Thorne wrote that when he confronted Grayle privately and refused to sign papers falsifying the fund's use, Grayle had threatened to destroy him, and that within a month rumors began circulating through Gull Hollow that it was Thorne himself, not Grayle, who had stolen the harbor fund. Rumors Thorne could never quite outrun, for Grayle was a wealthy and well-connected man and Thorne only a lighthouse keeper with a modest wage. Rather than let the money fall into Grayle's hands, Thorne wrote, he had withdrawn what remained of the fund from the bank in Grayle's absence, and hidden it here, in the one place he trusted, meaning to bring it before the town council and clear his name, a confrontation he never lived to make, for he died of a sudden fever that same winter, his secret sealed with him, his reputation buried alongside it, while Cornelius Grayle lived on, respected and prosperous, his family's fortune, Clara now understood with a slow and terrible clarity, built quietly upon a lie. She sat a long while with the ledger open on her knees and the fire burning low, understanding that she now held in her hands not merely money enough to rebuild her own small life, but the truth of a wrong done to a man dead 30 years, and more pressingly, a truth that touched a family very much alive in Gull Hollow still. For the name Grayle had not vanished from the town. It had grown. Cornelius Grayle's grandson, Josiah Grayle, was now the wealthiest man on that stretch of coast, the owner of the very harbor docks the fishermen depended on, a man who collected mooring fees and dock tolls from every boat in Gull Hollow, Tolls the fisherman grumbled about but paid without protest, having never known there was any other way it might have been. Clara understood, turning the ledger's brittle pages, that the harbor as it stood, its private docks, its steep fees, even the crumbling public breakwater the town still could not afford to properly repair, had been shaped, root and branch, by money that should have belonged to the fishermen themselves. She understood, too, with the particular ache of a woman who had recently been cheated by a forged signature of her own, exactly what it meant to be blamed for another man's theft, and she found she could not simply pocket the coins and walk away, however much her own poverty urged her to. She thought of Ezra Thorne's small, careful handwriting turning frantic on the page, a man trying, in the only way left to him, to leave the truth somewhere it might one day be found, and she thought of her own son, who had once stood at the base of this very tower and declared he meant to keep its light burning so no one would ever be lost on these ledges again. And it seemed to her, sitting there in the cold with the fire dying and the sea murmuring below, that some obligations outlast the people who first carried them. It did not take long for word to spread that the widow living alone in the old lighthouse had begun asking pointed questions at the county records office in the nearby town of Millbridge, nor for Josiah Grail to hear of it. For little escaped his notice in a harbor he considered, in every practical sense, his own. Clara had gone carefully, saying nothing yet of the ledger or the strongbox, only requesting to see the original town records from 1858, the minutes of council meetings, anything that might independently confirm what Thorne's confession claimed, for she understood that a dead man's private writing, however sincere, would not on its own be believed against a living man's reputation, and she meant to build her case the way her father had built a barrel, plank by plank, until it could hold weight without splitting. She found, after patient searching aided by a sympathetic young clerk named Mr. Oberlin, faded council minutes confirming the original fund had indeed been raised and entrusted to Cornelius Grail, and a puzzling gap in the harbor's financial records for the years immediately following, exactly where a full accounting of the fund's use should have appeared and did not. It was enough, she believed, to at least open a question publicly, though she knew Josiah Grail would not welcome that question being asked. He came to Widow's Point himself one grey afternoon, arriving by private carriage rather than boat, a broad, silver-haired man in a fine dark coat entirely unsuited to the rocky climb, and he was, at first, almost courtly, offering to purchase the lighthouse and its point outright for a generous sum more money. He said with a thin smile than the ruin was worth to anyone but a sentimental fool. Clara, who had learned patience at her father's workbench and composure through 2 winters of grief, thanked him for his interest and declined, saying only that she had grown fond of the place, and watched something behind his courteous smile go suddenly cold. He returned within the week with a different approach entirely, producing a survey that claimed the boundary of her half-acre had been improperly recorded, that a portion of Widow's Point in fact belonged to harbor land his own family had held for decades, and suggesting, in tones no longer courtly, that a woman alone, without funds for a lawyer, would find it difficult indeed to fight such a claim in Millbridge's courts. It was, Clara realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the wind off the water, precisely the sort of quiet, respectable cruelty his grandfather must once have used against Ezra Thorne, dressed now in a newer coat but cut from the same old cloth. She might have been frightened into silence, as perhaps Grail expected, had she been facing him with nothing but her own word. But she had, by then, not only the ledger and the strongbox, but also the beginnings of a case built from the town's own buried records. And she had, too, something Cornelius Grail's original victim had lacked, a community, however skeptical of her at first, that had not yet entirely forgotten what it meant to be shorted by the very docks it depended upon. She began carefully, and without accusation, to speak with the fishing families she had once quietly helped with their accounts, starting with Josephine Cray, who had shown her kindness with tar and driftwood, and through her with others, the Petrakis family, the widow Alden, old Silas Munro who remembered, now that he thought of it, his own father grumbling decades ago about a harbor fund that seemed to vanish into thin air. She showed no one the coins, wanting no rumor of treasure to cloud the truth of the matter, but she read aloud in Josephine's kitchen one evening with 4 or 5 families crowded close, Ezra Thorne's own words from the ledger, and watched old certainties shift on their faces the way ice shifts before it finally breaks. Word moved through Gull Hollow. the way word always does in small coastal towns, quietly at first and then all at once, until even those who had laughed at her for buying a cursed ruin found themselves murmuring instead about a wronged keeper, and a fund gone missing and a Grail fortune that might not, after all, have been so honestly earned. Josiah Grail, sensing the tide turning against him, tried once more to frighten her, hinting darkly of expensive lawsuits, and reminding the fishermen at a tense gathering in the town hall that Amos Bishop himself, of all people, had arranged in an apparent attempt to curry favor with the harbor's most powerful man, that without Grail's docks and Grail's goodwill, none of them would have anywhere to safely bring their catch to market at all. Word moved through Gull Hollow, the way word always does in small coastal towns, quietly at first and then all at once, until even those who had laughed at her for buying a cursed ruin found themselves murmuring instead about a wronged keeper, and a fund gone missing and a Grail fortune that might not, after all, have been so honestly earned. Josiah Grail, sensing the tide turning against him, tried once more to frighten her, hinting darkly of expensive lawsuits, and reminding the fishermen at a tense gathering in the town hall that Amos Bishop himself, of all people, had arranged in an apparent attempt to curry favor with the harbor's most powerful man, that without Grail's docks and Grail's goodwill, none of them would have anywhere to safely bring their catch to market at all. It was Amos's presence at that gathering, standing near Grail's shoulder with the same hard, calculating look he had once turned on Clara across a forged ledger, that steadied something in her rather than shaking it, for she understood in that moment precisely what kind of quiet alliance had always existed between men like her brother-in-law and men like Josiah Grail, an alliance built on the assumption that women left with nothing simply stayed with nothing and troubled no one further. She rose in that crowded hall, a woman still wearing her mended shawl, and asked to speak. And though her voice shook at first, it steadied as she read from the ledger itself, naming dates and figures, naming the gap in the harbor's own records that Mr. Oberlin had helped her uncover, and naming, too, gently but plainly, the debt the town had never known it was owed. She did not ask them to take her word alone. She asked instead that the county send an independent auditor to examine both the old records and the new, and offered, in the meantime, to place the recovered fund, now grown in her mind from a private windfall into something that had never truly been hers to keep, into a trust overseen by the town council itself, to be used exactly as it was always meant to be used, for the rebuilding of a breakwater that had stood broken and patched for 30 years. It was a harder thing to argue against a widow asking for oversight than a widow asking for belief, and even those fishermen most loyal to Grail's docks found themselves nodding slowly at the plain sense of it. Grail left the hall that night without having spoken again. His silence, for the first time since Clara had known him, more telling than any threat he might have made. The audit, when it finally came that summer, confirmed everything the ledger had claimed and more, uncovering not only the original missing fund but decades of quietly inflated dock fees. The Grail family had layered atop it, money drawn from fishermen who had never had any real say in the matter, for there had never been another dock to choose. Josiah Grail did not go to prison for the theft, however plain on paper belonged legally to a grandfather 30 years dead, and the law, Clara had learned by then, rarely moves as cleanly as justice deserves. But he lost, in the space of that single summer, the two things he had built his life upon: the town's trust and the harbor's monopoly, for the council, emboldened by what Clara's patient work had uncovered, voted to fund a second public dock using the recovered trust, breaking Grail's hold over the fishing fleet for the first time in 3 generations, and requiring as a quiet condition of settlement he accepted, rather than face further exposure in Millbridge's courts, that his family formally restore Ezra Thorne's good name in the town's own records, striking the old accusation of theft and replacing it, at last, with the truth. Clara stood at that same town hall the day the new record was read aloud, and felt something ease in her chest that she had not known was still clenched, for she thought of the small, frightened, careful handwriting in that ledger, of a man who had died with his honesty unproven, and understood that some debts, however long delayed, could still be paid. As for Amos Bishop, no court forced anything from him at all, for his sin had been smaller and more private than Grail's, a family cruelty rather than a public theft, and Clara found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not much wish to drag him before the town as she might once have imagined doing in her angrier moments. It was enough in the end that Gull Hollow itself had quietly reordered its opinion of him, that men who had once respected his shrewdness now watched him with the particular coolness reserved for those who kick a grieving woman when she is down, and that the boat he had taken, the Providence, needing repairs he could no longer easily afford now that his standing with Grail's circle had crumbled alongside Grail's own, sat increasingly idle at a dock he had once been so eager to keep her from questioning. He came to her once, that autumn, standing awkwardly at the base of the lighthouse steps he had surely once assumed she would starve beneath, and said, in the closest thing to an apology his pride could manage, that perhaps the debts had been more tangled than he'd first understood, and Clara, who had learned patience from her father and mercy, she supposed from her own hard road, told him only that she hoped he would do better by the next person who trusted him, and left it there, for she had rebuilding of her own to see to, and no strength left to spend on old grievances that had already, in their own way, been settled. By the following spring the new public dock stood finished at the harbor's edge, built with recovered trust money and the labor of fishermen, who no longer paid tribute simply to bring their catch ashore, and the old breakwater, patched and neglected for 3 decades, had been properly rebuilt at last, exactly as the fund of 1858 had always intended. Clara Bishop, once mocked for spending her last $11 on a cursed and crumbling ruin, found herself instead something closer to the keeper her son had once dreamed of becoming. For the town council, in gratitude and no small measure of guilt for how quickly they had once laughed her away, restored the widow's point light to active service under her care, funding a new lantern to replace the one long sold off, so that once again, after years of darkness, a light burned steady over that rocky point each night, guiding boats safely past the ledges her son had once promised to protect. She kept Ezra Thorne's ledger and his small, stern portrait on a shelf in the watchroom where she had found them, not as a trophy but as a kind of quiet companionship, a reminder that patience and honesty could outlast even 30 years of silence if someone was willing, eventually to listen closely enough to a hollow sound in an old wall. We began this story with a woman standing in the rain, 44 years old, with nothing to her name but $11 and a shawl gone thin at the elbows, laughed at by a whole town for buying a lighthouse no one else would want. We told you then that something sealed above that broken lantern room would change her life and restore a community, and we hope you can see now how fully that promise was kept. For what Clara Bishop found in that hidden panel was never simply money, but a debt owed across 30 years, a good man's stolen name, and a chance to set right a wrong that had shaped an entire harbor without anyone quite realizing it. She did not use what she found to become wealthy, though she certainly could have. She used it instead the way her father had taught her to use anything broken or discarded, by looking closely enough to see what it was truly worth, and by finishing, patiently and honestly, what someone else had been forced to leave undone. That, in the end, is the story of Clara Bishop, keeper of Widow's Point Light, a woman the town once wrote off entirely, who became instead the reason its light, and its harbor, and perhaps its conscience, burned steady once more. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Clara. If her story moved you, we'd be glad if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things, and overlooked people, often hold more worth than the world is willing to see at first glance. Before you go, we'd love to hear your answer to this. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. We read everyone, and we're always glad to sit with your stories the way we hope you've sat with hers tonight. Until next time, stay close.